corporate stock has ballooned by a factor of 61 since 1982, and the housing market has increased in value 18-fold. Those who serve the asset holders are similarly blessed. So the financial structure has become increasingly important as a source of profits in the United States and elsewhere. In the US in the 1950s and 60s, financial sector profits ranged from 10 to 15% of total profits in the US economy. Since the 1980s, the financial sector profits have been about 30% of total profits, reaching 40% shortly before the financial crisis. At the same time, wages have virtually stagnated. Inequality has risen, so Thomas Piketty has broadcasted the figures are now also familiar to all of us. The top 10% holds upward of 70% of the wealth in the United States, numbers approaching the kind of disparity that we saw in the Gilded Age. A recent study by the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that inequality will continue after COVID roughly as it did before. So although it was buffered somewhat by federal stimulus and measures during the pandemic, that effect will fade. And in fact, COVID has probably worsened inequality given the effect of COVID on poorer communities and communities of color. In the face of those trends, or perhaps at the root of them, we'll ask our panelists to comment on this. Policy makers pursue measures that seem calculated to protect asset holders and to channel wealth towards asset holders, or that do de facto do that. So the Fed puts a floor below asset values in any kind of emergency. Loans flow most abundantly to those with collateral. Public spending on entitlements is assumed to be inflationary and so vulnerable to cutback. When inflation does occur, economists routinely advocate unemployment as a solution. Driving up unemployment, we need to hike up interest rates enough to curb consumption and wages. We would like the panelists to explain, explore, inquire about this predicament and the remedies we might hypothesize and advocate in the face of this predicament. We're going to talk first about definitions, why there's been a trend towards calling the asset economy assetization as opposed to financialization, whether there's a difference between those terms. We're going to talk then about the genealogy, the history, how this trend has come about, whether it's new and different or the same old kind of dynamic we see across decades in the market, in market economies or in capitalism in specific. We'll then talk about the relationship of assetization to inequality, and then we'll talk about remedies. And we're going to try to run this as a conversation, which looks like we finally got the pieces assembled, so thank you for your patience on that. I'll ask questions, I'll ask the panelists to take it from there, and gesture at me if you'd like to intervene, or simply intervene if you have the space. Very briefly, I'll introduce the panelists and then we'll get started. So, Professor Martijn Konings, maybe you can wave, Martin? All right, it's a test too, we know you can hear us. Professor of Political Economy and Social Theory at the University of Sydney. He focuses on political economy and social theory, including recent research into the logics of asset capitalism and how that is transforming contemporary capitalism. I'm going to abbreviate my intros at this point. Professor Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie, maybe you can wave. A professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook. You all know her. She's the author of the best-selling The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. Aaron Medlin is doing his economics doctorate at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where he's researching the relationship between central bank policy and wealth inequality in the United States. And maybe you can wave, Aaron, so people know who you are. Benjamin Braun is a political economist at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. His research focuses on political economy and finance, as well as economic institutions and policies. And you know him as the scholar of asset managers and management. Professor Anna Chadwick is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Glasgow. She works at the intersection between law and markets and focuses on the legal nature of money and financial instruments the role of law in global financialization and financial speculation, particularly in the food market. So to return to our plan, what we'd like to start with is asking you about the term assetization and what we mean by that, whether there's a difference between assetization and financialization that matters for our discussion. And then we'll talk about how it is that we've come to whatever that new configuration is. So, how do we define assetization? Is it important to relabel a trend that may have been underway for some time? Martin?
Sure, yeah, thanks. So to my mind, it's quite important to make a distinction between financialization and assetization. Of course, we can define these terms however we want, but just going by how people normally use them and what that's and the kind of cluster of phenomena that they try to describe. So the way it's normally used, financialization diagnoses an imbalance in the economy. It's a story of innovation, speculation, kind of a movement of disembedding, whereby finance becomes increasingly divorced from the real economy. And this story still has a somewhat strong, quite a strong moral overtone. Activities that used to be done are no longer as prominent. And it also sees the social divide that financialization produces as quite clear cut. On one end, you've got creditors, owners of capital who want to lend out their funds. And then on the other end, you see the debtors, the people who need to attract credit and borrow in order to get by. That's what I think is sort of the financialization narrative. The idea of assetization, or of an asset economy, makes it much harder to think of finance on that morally charged imbalance, over-indebtedness model. Asset ownership is a balance sheet phenomenon that involves leverage and debt, and sometimes those things go wrong. But all the same, on a macro level, debt-financed asset ownership is subsidized in all kinds of ways, through guarantees, bailouts, backstops, etc. And this means that assetization has institutional supports that tend to become invisible in the financialization model, which financialization model thinks of this still as a sort of an outgrowth of autonomous market dynamics. Whereas in the assetization model, it becomes clear why some of those trends that we are so concerned about always last longer, have more legs, longer legs than we initially thought. And this is important because it also really muddies the water when it comes to depicting the social and the political conflict that emerges. So, the vast majority of borrowing is done to finance asset ownership. So it does not make that much sense to oppose owners to debtors, as the financialization model tends to do. The picture is more complex. And when we can sort of see some of the specific contours of assetization or the asset economy as this sort of a balance sheet phenomenon, I think that will allow us to see more clearly what we're up against.
So in your conception, everyone in the asset economy is an owner and can be a debtor also, right? We have all these conflicting categories, whereas made it sound more like we had a clear breakdown and could be a class breakdown between debtors and creditors at a simplified level. Am I getting it?
Yes, I did. You cut us for a little bit there. But yeah, so it's not that everybody is an owner in a way, but like ownership and debt go hand in hand. That is kind of the middle class phenomenon of almost all OECD countries. There's no creditor class facing a debtor class. These two sort of intersect.
I'm going to push you a little bit on that and invite more comments from the rest of the panelists. And I'm going to push in particular on an odd kind of anachronism to the term assetization, which sounds like commodification, right? We think back to Marx and Locke and the importance of assets and property ownership as the ingredients of a market society in general. We throw in money. Money allows the escalation of inequality because assets can be preserved in the monetary form, and in fact we can get alienation through the monetary form according to Marx. So in some ways it's a very old-fashioned terminology. By contrast, financialization, I connect with something that is more resonant with capitalism, right? The development of financial assets, financial instruments that allow the capture of credit and the trading of credit. So, and that I associate with, Larry Neal would say, 1720s, right after we get the development of public debt that circulates, and we get equities that circulate, we get the British government's support for capital markets and for trade in bonds. So oddly, the vocabulary seems to take us back to an earlier way of looking at markets and to, in some ways, obscure as opposed to make more transparent the move towards new financial instruments.
Sorry. Yeah, I can see what you mean by that, and by saying, well, you know, this is about assetization. It's about balance sheet phenomena and balance sheet guarantees. Obviously, taken by itself, that would be an overstate. Of course, like the last, 5 or 6 decades have seen like enormous amount of financial innovation that have been very important in putting in place the kind of business model that, made the constant provision of such new guarantees so important. But to come back to your point about, well, assetization seems a little bit like a sort of a variation on the commodification model. But I think I would say that the financialization literature sort of takes that commodification model and applies it to finance. Like this is just kind of things that are spiraling out of control in a way. It's markets going haywire. The advantage of the asset lens is that it allows us to see something new that is not visible through the commodity lens. And a few weeks ago, I was reading Minsky's submission to the 1957 Commission on Money, Credit, and Banking, I think. And I was really struck by how much already Minsky was able to see in 1957 by using this asset lens, really predicting very accurately the kinds of problems that the American system would be having in the 1970s, very similar to the way that sort of Marx could look at the commodity form and just kind of see things that were not yet actual. So that, I think, is the advantage of the asset economy model. There's a bit of a correction there of emphasis. Like, I do think that too much financialization literature is too taken in by the way the financial industry advertises its own techniques and innovations and new ways of doing things. I think, they're a little bit too infatuated with that at times. I think it's good to take a step back and say, sure, like those innovations have been important means for them to get around certain restrictions. But in the end, the reason that this financialization trend has been with us for so long has to do with the sort of gradual buildup of guarantees and supports for growing balance sheet leverage, just the general understanding that we cannot pull the rug out from under the system.
So let me open it up. Martin is trying to get at a phenomenon that is new, that has become identifiable recently with this vocabulary, and I'd like to hear others on the roundtable chime in about how we identify what this new phenomenon is, or whether you think there is a new phenomenon that has to do with the ownership economy, if you will. Ben? Okay, Anna?
Hi, sure. So I think I've been using or thinking of the terms financialization, assetization slightly differently from Martin. I mean, from what I've just understood, the assetization literature is a way of thinking more about how the kind of infrastructure for these financial innovations has been developed and how it links to the activities of governments and central banks and monetary systems, etc. I think I would push back a little on the argument that all of the financialization literature sort of buys into the narratives of finance. I mean, I would define financialization as a structural tendency within capitalism that in its most recent manifestation since the 1980s has led to enormous interconnected global financial markets that are increasingly setting the terms and conditions within which other actors, including governments, banks, corporations, businesses, and individuals are engaging in economic activity. And I would say, there are multiple facets to the phenomenon of financialization and that they're interrelated, but they're also the result of more specific and particular developments. So here I'm thinking about financialization referring to changing practices of banks and financial institutions themselves, but also developments in the corporate sector with corporate actors increasingly using financial investment tools for raising revenue, but also for risk management. And then what is discussed in literature on the financialization of everyday life. So I think for me, the asset economy is integral to financialization, but I've been thinking about that more in terms of a process whereby a variety of social relations that have already been commodified are turned further abstracted from the underlying economic and social phenomena that they represent, and really importantly are made commensurable through the spread of financial models, pricing tools, technologies, and contractual devices that enable traders to put a price on different aspects of the economic performance of particular markets, but also corporate and financial entities and states. And so for me, assetization, I think, speaks more to this slightly more specific development within financialization. And I think that there is critical literature on financialization that is all about trying to dismiss those kind of deregulatory finance being let loose kind of arguments that are made by critics of financialization, but in terms of framing it in terms of financial innovation and the banks being banks and financial actors unleashing their creative powers. I think there is literature in the on financialization that is trying to connect that back to the state and to show that states have always been complicit in allowing these trends. Thanks.
Can you give us an example of assetization? Do you mean things like extending the price mechanism to nature, to other kind of natural resources, to other sort of human phenomena? When you say you think of, I understood you as saying assetization is sort of captures a process of extended commodification so that different entities can be brought into the financialized world.
Yes, I think it does extend to things like commodification and making financial assets connected to to nature and things that have not previously been included in that sense. But I think more specifically, it's about these markets having grown in size and sort of being interconnected through financial pricing models that are embedded in particular contractual devices, and that mean that they process information in particular ways, and that what's happening is that further differences between, for example, the world of trading and investing in shares, and sort of what's happening with debt markets and what's happening with commodity markets are being brought together, because increasingly through this way of looking at markets, through this kind of infrastructure, we have a way of making these things commensurable, and so sort of they're subject to a particular financial logic, and trades are made that sort of are further flattening out and ironing out the differences between what were formerly commodified areas of the economy, but that perhaps weren't sort of all being subject to this overarching financial logic that is connected to the production of assets. So I think, to use some imagery that might be helpful for the way I'm thinking about it, I sort of see what's happening as kind of a real life manifestation in some way of Friedrich Hayek's famous representation of the market as a giant information processing machine that produces prices. But of course, for Hayek, this is about the orderly and efficient functioning of the economy, and prices have this coordinating role that is seen to be very beneficial. Whereas for me, and I imagine lots of other critics, what is happening is a form of disciplining of governments, corporations, other financial actors, and individuals in line with a logic of financial accumulation that, as the literature from social studies of finance and economic sociology has shown us, is produced through a very specific nexus of financial technologies, legal devices, and also cultural norms and assumptions within the particular cultural environment of trading rooms and of banks.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to get in on that definitional question? Ben?
Yes, thanks a lot. I wanted to return to Chris's point about capitalism, and I think bring in an understanding of financialization that goes a little bit more in that direction. And I think what financialization, why it's a helpful concept, because it helps us talk about the distribution of power between the financial sector and the non-financial sector. And that's really the lens that I find most helpful. And of course, that's only part of the literature that uses this angle. But I would say, just to name check a few writers where I'm coming from, I would mention Hilferding, but also Braun and Arrighi. So there's also a cyclical component, of course, to this. And so there I'm thinking about economic power. So the power of the financial sector vis-a-vis the non-financial sectors. And specifically with regard to what to produce and how, or put differently, where to invest. And so with regard to the question of capital allocation, which is the most important question in capitalism. And so under capitalism, workers generally have relatively little say in that decision, but that still leaves three other actors: corporations and their managers, finance, and the state. And these have been jostling for a position for a long time, and there are fluctuations in the distribution of power between those groups. And so financialization is, in my view, is a helpful concept when it refers to periods when finance is empowered vis-a-vis corporations on the one hand, but also vis-a-vis the state and the mechanisms by which it then exercises that power, and the actors that exercise that power, that varies greatly over time. And I guess we'll talk about mechanisms maybe later, so I'll just stop there.
So let me pick up on that and push the conversation to specify what's changed, right? So actually discussing definitions suggests a range of interests and a range of different ways of getting at these sort of evolving or developing phenomena. And my question is jumping off what Ben just said. What's changed that you want to highlight between, say, the relationship between, here are the categories that he flagged: finance, corporations, the state, and I would add asset owners. What has been changing that brings us into the room today? And in a few minutes, we'll get to the connection to inequality. But if you could work with those categories or add to them, how would you identify the changes in power that are producing the current predicament.
Maybe I'll just very quickly add one thing then, and my short answer would be it's the rise of institutional capital pools, which is a new thing. Banks used to be the dominant players, let's say in the around 1900, the dominant actors were banks. Today, the dominant actors are institutional capital pools of all kinds, institutional asset owners, but also asset managers, and they manage the money. They manage both what you could call public money, which is pension money, endowment money, foundation money, but also money for wealth owners. So which is private money. So there's also a socialization of private money, if you will, and agency is channel there is a sort of a higher level of coordination that is possible for wealth owners because there are these highly specialized asset managers. In my view, that's a big change.
Other changes.
Use the button.
Martin.
Yeah, my take on this is really that what is different from a sort of a long, still seen from a very long period of time, is democracy and the persistence of a middle-class politics. So when I think about sort of a classic account of financialization, like, Giovanni Arrighi's book, right? Like that sort of, shows us a picture of waves of financialization that happen when, capital is overaccumulated and needs to find other outlets. I think that's a generally sensible picture. I don't have that much disagreement with it. And as a way to understand financialization in history, that makes a lot of sense to me. But in our current situation, like since the 1970s, things have changed. This is no longer a wave of financialization that then kind of just comes down. It kind of keeps going, not necessarily up and up and up, but definitely on average, it does keep going up. And that is because of, our present era differs from these previous waves of financialization because of the way middle-class asset politics has driven the extension of that financial safety net. And that basically prevents all this debt from coming down to earth. There are actual supports in place to ensure that this can keep going. And to my mind, that is really the main difference. And it's something that, like, in current debates about neoliberalism, I think we've lost that a little bit, because we think of, like, capital as sort of an assault on democracy. And that is true, of course, in a certain sense, but like what we tended to miss out on is that, like, the sort of persistence of the middle class politics from the Keynesian era to the neoliberal era.
Stephanie.
Yeah, I want to sort of try to speak to, in an optimistic way, if I can, maybe a little bit about what might be changing. We think about the role of finance in the economy and the way that it has changed over nearly the last century, much less so oriented around the capital development of the economy. And there were references earlier to Minsky, and this is kind of, the framework that is sort of embedded in my macroeconomic analyses. And so when I think of the evolving nature of capitalism, which is a financial system, and the shift over time away from investment oriented around the capital development of the economy to the financialization of nearly everything, healthcare, education, housing, retirement. And where I want to be a little bit optimistic is, in the very recent past, and I mean really the last year or so, there are some signs that policymakers, especially through fiscal policy, are returning to a model that is more focused on investment and capital development of the economy. And we're all familiar with legislation, whether it's the infrastructure or the Chips and Science Act, or more recently, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, but a real commitment on the part of government to steer finance and financing back toward capital development of the economy, whether it's in manufacturing or green technologies and the like. And so while this definitely does not suggest that we're moving in a really significant way away from a financialized economy, it, I think, does give us something to sort of chew on as we have this discussion.
So let me just, let's hang on to that as the horizon that we're going to get to when we talk about remedies. And I want to push the panelists to build a few more planks before we get there in this picture that we're developing. So far we have two phenomena that have changed the rise of asset pools, institutional investment through asset managers. And we also have a change in middle-class politics, or maybe it wasn't changed so much, Martin, I understand you to be referencing the rise of, in many ways, financial assets as the politics of the middle class, right? Ownership of assets as the politics of the middle class. Are there other causal elements that people want to throw onto the table? And then we'll talk about the relationship to inequality. And then I want to get to Stephanie's observation about public policy. So any other changes that people want to flag as important elements? Ben?
Yeah, thank you. Let me just be a little more detailed. I would add specifically the importance of pension to both the rise of institutional capital pools, because the most important type are pension funds, and to Martijn's middle class asset holding point, because besides real estate, of course, the most important middle class asset are pension claims or retirement assets, which in a considerable number of rich countries consist of claims on the state and on redistribution through the state, but on financial investments held through pension funds, and the wedge pension funds drive through basically not just the working class, but basically the employed class in general is very considerable, and is a real change also, I guess, second half of the 20th century and ongoing.
So in some ways I'm seeing the Benjamin and Martin, your picture enriching each other, right, coming together. Anna?
Yeah, so just on the question of what's changed, I think it's sort of less on the positive side of things, but I think, I think we do have a situation, if we're thinking about what we're comparing to, so financial systems in the past, even earlier eras of extensive capital mobility, we know that these have been longer standing trends, as Origi and others have shown us, within capitalism. But I think what's different now is that we really do have a situation in which, herds of financial actors who are sort of cognitively embedded in the same ways of thinking about risk are enabled through sort of a combination of state-backed market infrastructures and networks of contracts and particular financial models to effectively exert a form of governance in the economy that certainly wasn't possible in the way that it is before, in the way that it is now. And I think this, it's very complex, but the way I see it is, it speaks maybe a little bit to our next question on how this drives patterns of inequality, but there's a way in which a lot of what is being traded and exchanged in many of these markets, are connected to what Omarova and Hockett have described as systemically significant prices in the economy. So I'm thinking of interest rates, exchange rates of currencies, prices of property, commodity rates, shares, etc. And in many ways, the power of these markets, can push and drive prices in particular directions that, can force governments to very much change course in terms of, the direction that they're taking with their economies. And I think, so they're exerting this form of governance through their controls of sort of the meta price mechanism in some way, which I think filters down into other prices in ways that need to be further studied, but also because in some ways this, they're very much able to take control of the future. So in terms of, predictions of what will happen if certain directions are taken, the question of how the markets will react is central. And I think also, if we think about the monetary system, we see how the role of, in these financial actors in kind of appraising the values of different currencies is now plugged into, our monetary systems post-Bretton Woods with these fluctuating currencies. So we really have a lot of our kind of monetary and financial infrastructure being in many ways, subject to the appraisals of these interconnected markets. So I think that's something that has definitely changed from the past.
So we've got this great picture now that really runs from Martin's observation about middle-class asset ownership through pension funds, through real estate ownership, through institutional investment and the management of those assets, to the momentum and force of financial players now becoming basically dominant as a governance mechanism, and many of those being traders, private actors, ultimately affecting financial administration, right? Monetary policy, financial officials. A really interesting picture. Does anyone want to add to that, adjust that? Here's where I'm going to go next. I'm going to ask, sort of how does that, can we flesh out the connection to inequality, to escalating inequality, as the next kind of step in our discussion?
Should we go first?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'll start. My starting point to this question, preparing for this, is that the mechanism creating inequality in capitalism is profit. So the question is whether financialization increases profit and whether it leads to an even more concentrated distribution of profits. So these two questions, then in its absence. And then in the second step, I'm back to power, because unlike maybe maybe different from economics, most of us would agree that achieving sustained high profits requires power in the economy, and then it is a question of how of whether financialization changes the way in which those making profits can exercise power. And I would just emphasize two forms of power that in political economy we talk about, and one is structural power, and the reason why financialization has been associated with an increase in structural power is that we think of it as, in its most basic form, exit-based power. So capital has the power to basically exit individual companies or entire countries. And financialization, one important aspect of financialization is financial globalization. And so there has been an increased ability, basically, for capital to move about the globe and use that threat to basically, extract higher payments to, for example, shareholders or bondholders and so on. Maybe I have argued in a paper recently that exit-based power has declined somewhat. Most corporations, large corporations maybe often don't need, but today especially don't need external financing very much anymore. But thanks to the rise of very large asset managers, there has been a rise of control-based power, which maybe is control-based structural power, whereby financial actors, again, as in the past, directly hold very large equity stakes, which also gives them power. And then the second mechanism that I would emphasize is infrastructural power, which is important to the relationship between financial actors and the state. And to the extent that state actors, first and foremost the central bank, try to govern through financial markets, that also empowers financial actors vis-a-vis the state when it comes to questions that Martijn is working on, such as bailouts and so on.
On that, yeah. But
Your comment on these types of power and their effect on the middle class and labor.
cool. So yeah, I think all these points that Ben just made are great and on point. I would probably put it a little blunter, I guess, and say that, the real cause of assets or assetization functioning to increase inequality has to do with the fact that it is underpinned by a too big to fail regime. And I know that's a misnomer, we can call it, something else, but the idea that the safety net that consists of guarantees, backstops, subsidies, puts, etc., that is what maintains a consistently upward pressure, puts a floor under certain asset classes and maintains a persistent upward pressure on those prices and allows certain positions to maintain high degree of leverage. Now, if that is the cause or the dynamic that causes it, then it's almost like, then it's not so much about how does financialization causes this. It's almost like, how could it not? If you've got this whole infrastructure that is structurally uneven, structurally asymmetrical, and it's activated at every point in the chain, how could that not result in an extremely uneven distribution of resources, of asset values? Yeah, and I think that is very important because, a lot of these discussions, when financialization literature start talking about things like poverty, there's this sort of image of the indebted subject, right? And that is a very real thing, of course, but I think the core of the issue has to do with, the balance sheet dynamic. The determining factor at this point in development of capitalism is increasingly whether people are able to borrow in order to purchase an asset that will appreciate in value. This is increasingly the fault line in contemporary society, and that is what is shaping inequality in the moment.
And in many ways, I'm hearing Martin and Ben before him, Martin more directly saying the kind of financial governance you're talking about is a financial governance that supports increasing upward pressure on asset values and makes determinative the difference between the ability to own those assets and the inability to own those assets. Just wondering if you want to comment on that. Anna, can you hear me? Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I'm sitting here and listening, and I can't help but remember something that Larry Summers said, I don't remember how many years ago, but his observation was that we do not know any other way to grow our economies except to inflate asset prices. We are totally dependent, and we have been for decades, on speculation and stock market and real estate and so forth as really the dominant engine of growth in the economy. So, starting in the 1980s, go back to the savings and loan and the thrifts, leverage buyouts, milk and junk bonds through the 90s, the NASDAQ, and into the 2000s with residential real estate, commodity market bubbles. Into the 2010s, it's crypto, it's NFTs, it's SPACs, it's meme stocks. Now it's, AI or whatever it's going to be. It seems to me, this is the recipe that we have adopted, we loosely, right, under a sort of neoliberal regime over the last 50 years or whatever it's been since the early 1980s. And we have not been willing to take on the power of the financial system. We make more or less modest adjustments in the wake of a crisis. We tinker around the edges. We don't really do anything to structurally reform the financial system. We don't really re-regulate and re-supervise, Dodd-Frank and Basel and so forth, but we still end up always kind of 2 steps behind. We don't, move to a system of directly provisioning finance. We don't challenge the core power of the financial system. We don't say we're going to have a public option in banking. We're going to have a public option in healthcare, in housing, in education, in all of these areas that are such a huge part of our economy and our lives that drive inequality. We continue to rely overwhelmingly on private finance to deliver what I think should largely be public goods. And should be no surprise that as we rely on the inflation of asset prices to deliver some period of economic growth and job creation, that when those bubbles burst and you have to deal with the aftermath, that it is the people at the bottom who get hurt the worst. And the widening of inequality, it takes them years to climb out of these holes. They never really get back to even before the next crisis comes. And so we just get that gulf that you referred to, Chris, at the very beginning, where the disparities between those at the top and those in the middle and at the bottom largely mirror what we had in the period of the Gilded Age. So I think that remains the big challenge going forward is, the structural kinds of reforms that need to be made to really upend what I think we probably all agree is a very broken economic system that gives rise to all of these, ills in society more broadly. And we're just not willing to do it.
Aaron, this is both Martin's point about the too big to fail and the upward pressure on asset values, and Stephanie's point about the way that we've moved into an economic policy that amounts to inflating asset values as the way we support the economy. Reminds me of your work. So do you want to get into this discussion on that point?
I think Martin's sort of perspective, towards this issue, is sort of trying to identify this sort of, I don't know if we want to call it a new underlying logic, but it is certainly kind of this new finance growth nexus where credit has to be supplied basically to households and finance to appreciate assets as a form of growth. We've moved from the model of actual productive investment and using credit to actually facilitate that. And so in order to sort of keep assets, in order to sort of provide households with kind of a middle-class lifestyle, they increasingly have to rely on these assets. And the main problem is that employment, and I think Martin brings this up in his book, which I've read a little bit of, is that employment in and of itself is not enough anymore to ensure a middle-class lifestyle, to compensate basically for kind of the volatility of employment, kind of the volatility of kind of markets and capitalism itself. And so we've kind of trained, I think he's trying to really put a picture on this kind of logic that we need to sort of internalize. This is the structure of the system. And so nothing short of actually restructuring that system in some way that actually moves income back to workers, and that we have, like, it's hard to add to what Stephanie Kelton has already just said, but having more direct social provisioning of education, of medical care, and so forth. These are the things that drive households to need emergency credit, fringe type credit like payday loans, and so forth, that ultimately extract rents from these people and ultimately reinforce and increase existing inequalities. On top of whatever inequalities are already produced by capitalism itself, right? Apart from just finance, the very structure of power between capital and workers.
So great. So let's move, Anna.
Sorry, I just wanted to add. I mean, I think building on this, I think I found the work of a number of Marxist scholars particularly helpful speaking to this question between financialization and inequality. And I think it also speaks to what we were talking about before, to this idea of what's changed, and the fact that we sometimes talk about a new logic of financial accumulation, and their contributions have to be understood within a particular field of sort of Marxist theory, and to understanding how accumulation can happen requires not seeing all of this profit circulation that's happening in the financial sort of stratosphere as being profit in this sense, but seeing how this is actually a new form of a model of accumulation that produces new capital, which requires the exploitation of surplus labor power. And so I'm thinking of people like Lapavistas, Harvey, but also Sotiropoulos, Milios, and Lapathiouros, who've shown how, in a way, finance enables this greater exploitation of labor power. So it is connected to the underlying productive economy by, for example, enabling financial and commercial actors to outsource elements of production to more cost-effective jurisdictions and dealing with the associated risks of that. So that also speaks to like driving down wages in other economies. Also to how financial metrics are being used to discipline companies into intensifying the exploitation of labor in order to boost their share price. Or, for example, what sort of mentioned about extending the reach of finance into households via credit schemes, with the particular importance that reduces the amount of money that the capitalist has to pay for real wages. So kind of replacing that with a credit relationship. So I think it's interesting to think about, if we specifically want to think about this as a new mode of financial accumulation, then we have to think about how it's also connected to the exploitation of labor in this sense, I think.
So excellent. It's you and Aaron have built a bridge basically to the what is to be done question. Right. So the last question I'd love to hear from you, and then we'll open it up. We'll have some time for questions if we're lucky here. Someone can remind me that our timing on the session. But what is to be done? Stephanie got us started here. What are the particular reforms that you would favor? And if you can, as you're articulating them, gesture towards their political feasibility. Where do we start?
Just chip in here. Like, what is to be done, I always think is a very sort of action-oriented sort of take on it. Like, I think we're still at the stage where we may not exactly know what the field looks like, and sort of, we need to do some preparing before we can sort of really decide what is to be done. And by that, in particular, I mean, where should we be looking? So some of the proposals that are currently floating around that Stephanie mentioned, like industrial policy, new supply side progressivism, new productivism, all those kinds of things. They can be very inspiring. And, I too hope that they get up. But it also strikes me that all of them do not engage sort of, the core issue of money production. The fact that they all leave alone this issue, the banking issue, essentially. And like when you look at the history of Keynesian theory, like this is, a very, the history of Keynesian theory and Keynesianism as a practical program is completely shaped by that, like, wanting to do certain demand-driven programs, not being able to do it because it pushes into inflation, then taking up developing supply-side programs in support of that also not working, but certainly putting capital in a much better position to demand cheaper labor and all kinds of other subsidies. So the kind of thinking that I think right now is finding some traction with Biden and his advisors has a long history, and it's not a great history. Like this is a history of sort of foiled objectives, things that petered out, and endless subsidies to capital. And to my mind, the key thing that is missing is just a focus on money. And I think this is where MMT understands something better than some of the sort of the growth Keynesian literature. If you cannot engage directly the way society has set up its infrastructure for the production of money, you're not going to get very far.
Let me hear the question this way, right? Do we use the existing system, pushing it to capacity in a Keynesian fashion, right, including industrial production, or this is how I'm hearing your intervention, Martin, or do we try to change the system of money creation, change the institutions of money creation?
Well, I do think it is about pushing, just even with these policies we just mentioned, like pushing as far as you can. But what happens in those moments is that, yeah, there will be inflation or some other effect that people hadn't been able to predict and don't know what to do with. At that point, sort of the knee-jerk Keynesian response is always to sort of, shy away from it and then start looking for technical fixes to, manage the situation. Whereas I think we need to learn to re-see those moments where something genuinely does not seem possible as, openings into the monetary constitution of society.
Stephanie, do you want to comment on that? It seems like you're out.
Yep. Yeah, I think we need to do the latter, Chris, in the formulation of your question. I think we need to introduce competition into the banking system. I think we need to reduce concentration, and we're clearly going in the other direction. I think at the moment, we're likely to have fewer financial institutions, fewer banks in the years ahead. It just looks that is going to be the case. I think, we haven't really talked about securitization, but I think that's, it's very difficult to have an hour plus long conversation about financialization, really, without talking about securitization and the role of securitization in financializing everything. I think that banks need to be essentially forced to hold more risk, that we need a return to the model of relationship banking that the originate and distribute model got us into trouble, continues to get us into trouble. I think we need to rethink that. We've talked about reestablishing a public role in financing the community, the capital development of the economy. I think we are off to something of a good start there, but we need to do more, I think, on regulation and supervision of the financial system. There is scope for much more to be done. And then I'll finish where I started, which is the direct provision of financial services. I think direct lending to support public purpose. I think doing more with guarantees for public-private partnerships. I think postal banking, community development banks, central bank digital currencies, all of this should be, I think, part of any effort at, substantively reforming the financial system to make it, more stable, more equitable, and, serving the needs of the people in a broad way that we've been talking about here today.
Yeah, I would agree with all that, but I think we do risk kind of sort of following the same logic. We're just shifting kind of this credit provisioning from, say, the private sector to the state, and that'll have its own benefits. It may have its own costs that we have to sort of think about and take account of. But ultimately, the underlying structure of how incomes are distributed has to also be taken into account. What drives a lot of this phenomenon is simply the maldistribution of income. And finance definitely, again, reinforces that and exacerbates those inequalities. But yeah, restructuring in a way that redistributes income, things like raising the minimum wage, maybe providing a more robust earned income tax credit, and things like that. Policies that actually help redistribute income in ways that are more equitable will reduce kind of the need for a lot of these kind of financial services. It'll reduce the amount of capital among the wealthy that ultimately feeds into these large financial pools, right? Ultimately, we'll solve it, and then there's also, like, if we think about the pension systems, a failure of the state to provide a pension system. So in that instance, Stephanie's also right there, being able to provide a public pension system that guarantees kind of people's incomes in retirement will probably reduce kind of the need for these large financial pools to sort of find additional assets that they need to invest in so that they can get a return. These are things that can kind of help reduce private financialization, the dominance of private finance over the economy. That'd be my only thought there.
So Ben, and then we'll open it up for questions. Ben.
Yeah, I can just say that I fully endorse what Aaron just said, and would also have said that I would, in my framework, I would think about the main sources of money managed by institutional capital pools, and, for example, by private equity funds, who are at the forefront of assetizing so many parts of basically increasingly our social infrastructure and social reproduction. And the sources for that money is the wealth of the very wealthy, and their taxation is probably the main solution for draining that source. And then the pension system is the other, and maybe also the higher education system in the US, because endowments are another source. And what these two have in common is that the way to drain that source would be the public provisioning of these services, old age provisioning via pay-as-you-go pension systems, and not just in the US, but globally. Pension money is everywhere. It doesn't stop at the border, and higher education and so on.
Excellent, thank you. All right, we have time for some questions, and we'll start I'm not quite sure how to channel in the Hamburg questions, but let's get going on the Cambridge side, and maybe we'll be able to figure that out. So we'll have the mic here for the panelists in a minute.
Yeah, Chris, like we should invite people to answer as well. You take a call on the way.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks to the panel. I'm always a bit frustrated by the somewhat parochial nature of the discussion around financialization. Because, Benjamin mentioned globalization in passing only. This is a global system, maybe even an imperial system, as we were discussing yesterday. So let me try and make another link between institutional cash pools on the one hand and inequality in the global north. There are different moments in the cycle of capital, right? This is still M, C, and prime, but C is happening somewhere else. So you guys don't see it as much. You're seeing the M and prime moment and calling it financialization, right? But C is happening plenty. C is happening in China. C is happening in India, Bangladesh, Vietnam. But C is also happening in other varieties of advanced capitalism. C is happening in Korea, in Japan, in Germany. Now, I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that all of the capital sloshing around is productive capital, right? Much of it is bubbly, to be sure. But if a healthy portion of it wasn't productive, then the asset structures would not get validated to some extent, right? This is a Minsky point. So bring it to then institutional cash pools. Who are the big sources? One of the big sources of the institutional cash pools is, of course, and this is from Zoltan's paper, is the profits and the cash hoarding of non-financial corporations. Big tech. Apple is sitting on $200 billion of cash, right? Apple's profits come from global production. So the raw material for this assetization is enabled by a radically unequal global division of labor. Okay, and this of course is the China shock, so-called. Right? This is where the jobs are. The American working class is in China. So to a very large extent. So the US is, Kielberger has said this long ago, and Perry's worked on this obviously, is that it's a world bank. So to Stephanie's point about the capital development of a nation, it's just another nation. The capital development is still absolutely happening. It's just not happening here, right? And you guys are calling it financialization. So what is to be done? Professor Omarova said what is to be done yesterday, and it is, I'm afraid, Martin, the productivist agenda, which is that you need domestic development banking to push domestic jobs here. That is going to, because of course the jobs the bottom has fallen out of jobs, and that is your source of inequality. And so unless you have some method of banking for the people, and that is exactly what I take the NIA to be, then I don't think you can get to first base on this.
Any comments from the panelists? Stephanie.
I mean, just very quickly, I'll just say we have a domestic development bank. It's called the Federal Reserve. And if the goal is to enhance the capital development domestically of the economy and to have banking for the people, as we heard, that can happen through Congress. That can happen through legislation. And that legislation will tap the financing because Congress writes the bill and commits the funding. The Federal Reserve is our domestic development bank. It's all we need. But we would need legislation carefully crafted, oriented around doing precisely what we just heard. So that's all I want to say.
Let me just add one, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Pardon? You answering that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thought in the sense that, yeah, I could see the danger of these financialization debates. Sometimes they can feel a little bit like we're trying to sort of work out models, right? Like what would be like a model of financialization that you could have everywhere kind of thing. And you kind of lose the sense that, well, this is a very specific geographical model. One of the advantages of, I think, the assetization or the asset economy concept is that, makes it very clear that, no, this is not something that could ever be universalized. This is a way in which specific groups in the OECD countries maintain their privileges even after the collapse of much of the Keynesian welfare state. I think that is what we should be talking about in any case. Yeah.
We have some online questions here. You have them?
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, yeah. So thanks everyone for this very interesting panel. My name is Aris Lior. I am joining this conference from Finland remotely. And my background is that I am actually a trained linguist and cultural studies scholar, basically. And what I'm doing is that I'm doing voluntary work for a Finnish small NGO, whose name translates into English as economic democracy. And we have been talking here about democracy and how, for example, Stephanie said that the Congress can change things if it wants to. So as someone who works on advocacy, I think that the problem that we at least are facing here in Finland, and I think that applies to everyone who is advocating for monetary system reforms, is that it's so far removed from the daily experience of ordinary people that it's impossible almost to talk to someone like a guy on the street or a girl on the street and say that, by the way, yeah, do you know how the monetary function is? The workings of the monetary system actually influence your life, or it's just so far removed. So what I'm saying is that I find these academic conferences very interesting in terms of how to apply what you are talking about here in advocacy on the ground, basically, or trying to do that at least. But still, I just want to point out, and also I want to say one a favorite quote of mine, which is from Thomas Alva Edison, is that vision without execution is hallucination. So this is something that, for example, Martijn, you said that we need to develop our thoughts more. I completely agree. But what we have to do as well is to try to work with the things that we got, with the understanding that we have, and try to achieve political change, I think. And I want to say another quote, which actually is from Michael Jordan, the basketball player. Some people want it to happen, some wish it would happen, and others make it happen. So again, how can we bridge the gap between the academia and the people who are actually doing policy work on the ground, be it in civil society or within political parties, for example. And one more quote that I want to say is that success is the sum of small efforts repeated day in, day out. I don't know who this is from, but still, I think in political terms, we need to have this grand vision of change of the financial system and the monetary system as our goal, but we need to figure out small steps and achievable goals towards that end.
Okay, let me take that as a question for the panelists. How do we connect this discussion to people who are trying to make change on the ground?
I imagine that Stephanie would actually have a lot more to say about this than I would, since she has really brought her work to vast audiences. But just from my angle, I find that young people especially are extremely financially literate. Over the past years, I have done tons of presentations about that asset economy book that I wrote with some other people. And time and again, I've been struck by how people understand it, with that even the concepts that I was like, okay, this might be a little bit too academic-y. It's not. I think people will engage with academic concepts when it actually allows them to make more sense of their situation. I think that is sort of the rule.
I think that was very well said. I think, you're going to present differently to different audiences, and I would not give the same kind of talk or have the same conversation maybe with a group of young activists that I would have with a group of staffers or lawmakers in Congress or elsewhere. But how do you make progress on this front? I think it's being willing to have those conversations with a really diverse group of stakeholders. I'm just as happy to walk into a room of, well, maybe happier even, young, interested, involved, passionate activists as I am, to sit down with a group of people who already consider themselves financial experts, which I do as well, or with staffers, who are there to grind out the legislative text. But you have people, I know, Chris, sitting there in the audience with you right now are a number of MMT scholars, many with legal backgrounds, who also go and work with people in Congress on legislation, educate staffers. And so it's a multi-pronged, you're fighting this battle on many fronts and trying to push forward a better understanding and move policy where you can by just showing a willingness to, have those conversations and to make yourself available to people who, I think, more times than not, they really do welcome the input and the insights from academics. So that's just all I want to say.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions quickly. We'll wrap them together from the audience. Shanoy, I understand you should be signaling me there. So if you could take the mic to 2 people and just pick the people, please. We'll take the 2 questions in succession. Please keep it kind of brief, and then we'll allow the panelists to answer.
Thank you. My name is Shengpei Guo. I've been a financial professional for like 20, 30 plus years. So my question really regarding the assetization and financialization. So my impression through hearing the talk is we're talking about really the type, because I think it's important to look at where on the balance sheet these things appear, right? If I look at assetization, right, most of the stuff we talk about appear as product on, let's say, financial firms' asset side. And to the same degree, the financialization also appear, in fact, on the asset side of the financial firms. However, if you look at assetization, you can really, in my way of looking at that, compare of the asset side of any company, including real economic companies. And financialization can, in fact, appear on the liability side of the real economy. So when those things happen, in fact, they create investment process, create the real capital accumulation in economy. And the form, I think, that possibly is causing problem is when all these things appear within the financial companies, and some of that, if you look at the financial companies' liability
Can I
side.
ask you to keep it short? We're just going to take your question and another one.
No, I'm just thinking about the really, should we look at where these things appear, whether it's on the real asset or liability side of real companies and financial companies, and how the monetization to support the process, where do they occur, right? So really, I think when we look at these terms, we probably need to figure out exactly how and where they appear. Yeah.
Okay. Shanoy?
I was walking here this morning and decided that I have to tell you about myself. I'm one of we the people. I have lived through all of the Great Depression, through the Great Wars, through the glorious days that we had in the 60s and into the 70s, and I have suffered through the neoliberal rape of our society by those who have and receive most from our societies. And there has to be changes. I've read your books over the last decade. I've probably spent 20,000 hours reading your books, listening to your debates and your papers and all of this thing. And I kind of wish I hadn't, because I have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and I fear for what's going to happen to those people. Now, we have to we have to, number one, stop guaranteeing the debts of those few people that are taking the most from our economy. We're guaranteeing the debts of the banks and the financial institutions. We have to stop that. We cannot circulate debt anymore. We have to create the money equal to the growth of the goods and services or the actual creation of goods and services that we create. We can do that by we the people creating all of the money and providing it to the private sector as needed by our economy. But we just can't give it to the private sector because it is a valuable thing. That service, just as our police service and the military and all the rest are valuable services that we the people need. We need the medium to run our financial sector. And that money should come from we the people, created equally for we the people. It's created by our government. Then it goes to the private sector where it's used not equally by we the people, but it is used by certain people. They may use that money, they may make 15 or 20% a year, or maybe more. They'll charge interest to our households at 20 or 25% on their credit cards. Anyway, they're going to make some money off of that money, and we're giving them the use of that money for nothing. Now that's my money. That's we the people. They should be paying us for that money. They should be paying us a fair rate. The banks now are loaning out money that they pay nothing for. They're charging for their risk, their overheads, and their profits, but they're charging nothing for the use of the money. We should be charging the private sector for the use of our money, a fair return. I don't know what it might be, 4%. It was always pretty good on a savings account. We were willing to loan our own money at 4%. So maybe as a group, as we the people, we could get 4%, or maybe we should say, well, it's worth more than 4%.
I ask you to wrap it up. I totally get the message. I think the message is loud and clear.
Now, the thing is that I probably only have 7 or 10 years left, and I'd like you people to get busy and get together and plan something in the financial. One thing you have to do is stop talking money.
Okay, I'm going to stop there.
I'm going to
stop you there. I think we end with a real challenge to all of us. So I thank you all, including for your patience with our tech problems, and we'll go off with the mandate. Thank you.